one. And all right, so real quick before I get into the meat of today, everybody feels pretty comfortable with the portfolio sites? You're posting your portrait on there as a post so that when I go and check it, it'll be there? Anybody want me to go real quick over the basic, huh?
I emailed it to you.
I only emailed it to you.
Okay, I want it both, okay, so to clear, I want it both ways. I want it emailed and it needs to be posted to the site.
Cool.
Can you do like a quick overview?
Yeah, absolutely.
You wanted us to title it portrait assignment or first assignment?
Doesn't matter.
Oh, just a quick question about the caption.
Uh-huh.
Like, there wasn't much. Like, what were you expecting for the caption? I guess.
Right. So I mean, there's not a lot to write in a portrait caption. Give me as much of the basics as you. Who's in the photograph, where they are, what the location is, right? The date, all that. Just in the format that's given, and then maybe if there's more about them that you can write for a second sentence. Doing a portrait of me. Adjunct journalism instructor Sean Elliott sits in the classroom where he teaches class, Wednesday, February 16, 2022, period. Elliott is also director of photography at the Day newspaper in New London.
Yeah.
So, that sort of thing. All right, so, real quick. There's the site. This is mine. Yours looks just about exactly the same. So what you're going to want to do, like Professor showed you could either go up here to New and pull down to Post, or you can go over here to Posts and hit Add New. Doesn't matter which way you do it. But you go ahead and click it. All right, so if you're going to do portrait assignment. All right, nobody tell me if I spelled that wrong. All right, and then right here you have add media, and what that'll do is it'll take you to your library of media that's already in your system. If you don't have anything in there or you're adding the photo, you click on the upload files here and the button select files, and that will let you navigate to wherever it is you want to find your photos. I'm not actually going to do that because I have plenty of photos in my library. So once you've done that, it'll be in your media library. So there's all the possible photos you could add. And we're just going to pretend that this one is a portrait. All right. If your caption is embedded in the photograph, and I'll show you how to do that at some point, it would already appear right here. If it's not, you can add it here yourself, or you can add it in later after you've uploaded it. But once you've picked the photo you want, you can go ahead and change the attachment settings here, or you can do this after the fact as well. When you're posting something that's going to be a standalone photo like this, unlike Patricia Shanahan showed you how to do the thumbnail for your about, and she told you to use the thumbnail setting, you want to go ahead and use full size probably, or large, but not anything, nothing small, and just click insert into post. All right, so there we have the photo. Because the caption was already embedded, it appears here, but you can also type more afterward, hopefully, without so many typos because I'm typing in a hurry. You can click on the photograph and you get this little edit window here that comes up. It gives you the align left, align center, align right, no alignment. So you can choose those. You can also hit the edit, which will call the photograph up again. Once again, gives you those options: full size, featured size, large. Gives you the left, center, right, none, and also gives you the caption field, so you can add the caption here as well. You update, and all you do is hit publish. And then we go to the site, which you can do up here where it says visit site, or you can already have it open, and there it is, just like that. All right? Once again, this is recorded. Professor Shanahan's is recorded and posted on course content, so you can also go back and review the recording if you need to. It's pretty straightforward, pretty easy, right? Yes?
So I did mine as a page. Do you want as a post?
So Professor Shanahan was suggesting they be done as posts. At some point in time, you will create a photography page on which you will put photographs separately so that you'll have a page for your photography, a page for your writing, a page for multimedia, whatever else is they put you through course-wise. In the short term, it doesn't matter to me where it goes, as long as when I go to your site, I can see something to click on and I can see the photo posted with the caption. It's just making sure that you're fairly savvy. You might want to go back and redo it as a post just for the sake of doing it that way, just so you've practiced both. It doesn't matter all that much which way you do it. All right. Any more questions on the portfolio site? I will point out real quickly. It's the theme that I've been using here doesn't put a thumbnail in here for the photo unless I designate that. So if you're using the theme that Professor Shanahan set you up with as the default, you don't have to worry about that. But that's why there's a blank spot there. You won't have one if you're not in this theme. All right. Did I go through that fast enough but slow enough? Okay. So starting this week, you're going to start taking, shall we say, more serious photographs. We're going to try doing some news or feature photographs. I want to talk about the idea of the photographic moment, or as Henri Cartier-Bresson called it, the decisive moment. All right, Bresson was a 20th century photojournalist, street photographer. He liked to call himself a humanistic photographer, which just means that he really liked to take pictures of the human condition as opposed to taking pictures of buildings and architecture and landscapes, right? This was a time, early, mid-20th century, photography was still fairly new. It was still moving forward into this much more fluid style that we have now. Bresson started to use a camera called a Leica, which was a small 35 millimeter rangefinder camera. So as opposed to the press cameras that the earlier photographers had been using through most of World War II and prior to that, which were very large, bulky, slow to use, the Leica was, well, even smaller than the camera I carry today. It was, it's about this big. You could put a roll of film in it as opposed to a single sheet at a time. Anywhere from 12, 20, 30 photos before you had to change film. And it was relative, like I said, small. It was quiet. It just made a very small click. And Bresson really liked to use that fairly surreptitiously. He would often hold it kind of at waist level so it didn't even look like he was taking a picture. He might compose a picture, get his focus set, and then he'd kind of lower the camera down like this and wait for people to kind of resume doing what they were doing as opposed to mugging for the camera, and then he'd click the frame. So Bresson coined this phrase, the decisive moment. You'll often hear me talk about the storytelling moment, the photographic moment in general. We're not talking specifically about that period of time defined by the shutter click, right? A camera shutter will be open for a 60th of a second or 125th of a second or 1,000th of a second. The moment is not per se a defined period of time. The moment is a much more, what's the word I'm looking for? I don't even remember. I wrote it down. And it's much more intangible than that, right? The moment is defined by all of those elements that are in the photograph that make it storytelling, that make it eye-catching, that bring the reader into the photograph and make them connect with it. So sometimes we're just not going to capture that moment per se that's, shall we say, perfect, that's decisive. Bresson liked to think of it as the term I use, like I said, is storytelling. It's that moment that may not necessarily be the peak action. The photograph on the left is what we would call peak action. It's that moment where everything is frozen right at the peak of the action. But on the photograph on the right is a different kind of decisive moment. All right, it's much quieter, it's much more subtle. It's defined much more by emotion and feeling. So the decisive moment can be either of those things. It can be both of those things. In sports photography, we talk a lot about peak action moments, which is that moment, for example, in football where the receiver is stretched to the maximum and the ball is right on the fingertips. That's a peak action moment in sports. That is not necessarily what every decisive moment is. So here's some more contemporary examples. I particularly loved this one because it mirrors that Cartier-Bresson image of the man jumping across the puddle. Once again, very much peak action, but also very storytelling, capturing sort of a whole lot of what you want to see in one picture. Here's that much more intangible kind of moment. Not necessarily exactly the peak action, or maybe it is, but what it really is it captures your emotion. It really makes you want to know more about what's going on. Another example, just a lighter moment. This is about, the weather can sometimes be news, sometimes it's not news, but when you find humans interacting with it and you find that time when they're having their fun, they're completely lost in themselves, not paying attention to the camera. Another kind of thing, once again, sort of the pregnant pause, if you will. There's no real great action here, right? The person's not swinging through the air, there's no big splash, but there's so much going on, there's so many layers. You really get this deep sense of what these people are feeling and experiencing, more than if the photograph were taken from farther away, or if for whatever reason, the person with the rope swing were in a different body position so it didn't look like they were about to be moving. It's the kind of thing that draws your eye in. This is very much a very hard news kind of decisive news moment. A protest situation in Washington, D.C. You get this real sense between the expression on the woman's face, the body language on the man on the right. You really feel like you're drawn into this. This is, I think, a really classic example of the decisive moment. So I like this quote just because, like I said, Bresson brought up this concept of the decisive moment, and sort of we're always in search of it. And sometimes you just have to realize that you're not always going to get it. Sometimes it's going to get away. So, like it says, you can't tell the person, please smile again, do that gesture again. I love this quote, life is once, forever, right? So, really quickly, I already told you a little bit about Bresson, a few more examples of his work. So, for example, if the woman in the middle there does not have her hands up, maybe it's a much more static image, but because of that, you've got a little bit of a sense of motion, a little bit of a sense of engagement. This actually defies a lot of rules that I will probably tell you over the course of the semester, which is to get people's faces, to get in front of your subject as opposed to behind them. We let Bresson get away with this because of who he is and how long he did this and how legendary he was. That said, obviously there are going to be times when you can get away with that. Most of the time, we want to see faces. We want the human preference is to engage with each other via our eyes. I think the only thing that's made this pandemic era tolerable is that we at least still get to see each other's eyes. So these are the readings I gave you last week. So I'm just going to leave them up there. Excuse me. So I'm going to go ahead and do this in this order, even though I think I want to. Yeah, we'll do this order. So starting next week, news photos are your assignments. So news photos are candid moments, like we talked about with Bresson. I'm not going to hold you to the standard of the decisive moment. Every photograph does not have to be this perfect embodiment of that storytelling moment. But I do want you to go out and look for candid moments that are happening out in the real world. So this is not about getting people to pose for you. It's not about getting people, to stop and smile. It's about finding them doing whatever it is in the performance of their everyday lives. I noticed last week I walked out of here and there'd been a walkout. There was a big crowd out on the plaza with speakers and stuff like that. That's a classic news photo situation. So you're going to look for stuff like that, but you also can look for anything else that's going on. I noticed the bulletin boards downstairs are full of all sorts of activities and stuff. There's a bartending class. There's therapy dogs. So there's apparently a situation where people are bringing therapy dogs. Students can go and see them. I love every assignment I get to do with therapy dogs because I get the therapy while I'm getting paid for it. So news, photos, and image tells a story of a news event or issue through the actions of the people involved or affected. So they can come from planned events such as rallies and marches, any kind of civic event. They can be spontaneous happenings like weather and natural disasters, conflicts or such. So right here we have a couple of examples, and we'll go through some others. On the left is a homecoming for a Navy submarine. Sailor reunited with his loved one on the pier. This is a planned event. We know it's happening, but that's your news photo. On the right is a story about a hotel dealing with the pandemic. Photos taken over a year ago now, almost 2 years ago. So this is a picture of a person spraying disinfectant through a hotel room. And the one next door that they'd already sprayed, leaving the door open so the smell isn't so strong. So both news photos, both sort of very tangible moments in time. Another military-related one. This one is a deployment. So a soldier and his wife hugging goodbye before he gets on a plane to fly overseas. Upper right is a fire. I'm not going to expect you to go out and chase fires or accidents, so we'll sort of try to stay away from what we call spot news kind of thing. But I do want you to look for other things. Bottom right is just a public rally, people celebrating nuclear disarmament across the world. So then the next offshoot from the news photo is what we like to call sometimes a feature photo or a slice of life photo. These are less, shall we say, newsworthy. They're not really about hard news. They're not about major issues, but they're capturing those slices of life of human experience. So people in the sunflower field, people at the local skating rink, sledding on the hill after a snowstorm, and or the local group that brings big fancy kites to the park just for entertainment. So these are the kind of things. We're not going to strictly stick to the need for hard news photos, so you can also look for the soft news or the features. The weather is going to be, I think, one of your easiest ones if we get any more weather other than cold over the rest of the semester. When it starts to warm up, there's going to be this time when all of a sudden all of the students start to flood back outside and enjoy the weather, the nice weather. That's another aspect. But you can also look for sort of any other kind of time where people are living their lives within the context of what's going on in the world around them. So you can look for the hard news, or you can look for the soft news, either one. Any questions? So this will be, you'll have 4 of these over the next, I don't have a schedule for me, it's the next 6 weeks we have left. If you're having trouble thinking of something, feel free to ask. Like I said, check the bulletin boards. I think the Daily Campus has a calendar section that'll tell you of events happening on campus. But just look for anything that's people living their lives. Obviously, if you can get, a rally or a protest that's happening, that's great. If there's something related to the pandemic response on campus where you can see something that's related to that, that's great. So look for anything like that. I'm happy to help problem solve if you're having a block. These are links, and I'll actually, when I get out of the slideshow here in a moment, we'll go and look at it really quick. The National Press Photographers Association has a monthly contest for newspaper photographers, and the winners of that contest in The general news and the feature category are really good examples of the kind of photographs that people like me who work at newspapers go out and do every day. So you can look at those and see if that gives you some ideas. You see a photo and go, oh, I know when something like that happens. Then you'll know you can go take a picture of it, and that sort of fits. So, and that is links that weren't meant to be left in this slideshow. I don't know why I left that there. All right, so pretend I didn't do that. All right, so really quick. So this is the monthly news clip contest. Just some real examples. So the NPPA breaks their contest up into 3 categories we're talking about here. General news, which are these more routine kind of news events. Spot news, which is, like I said, the breaking news, the fires, the accidents, the natural disasters. And then what I called features, what we also call slice of life. You know, so just really quick, I'll click on something, right? So this is just went to the aquarium, photographed people looking at penguins, and in this case, the photographer captured a really great reflection of the child's face, which was really what makes this photograph sing. Without that reflected face, it's just the back of a couple of heads and some penguins, right? So, and then here we have a neighborhood picnic kind of event, and the kids are having a tug of war. So this is right there. This is that very soft news kind of stuff I was talking about. This is not, major politics. This is not, geopolitical issues. This is not the pandemic. This is not, whatever social issue of the day. This is a community event. This is important to the people in the community, and most of what we do in journalism is community journalism. We cover the community, so this is the kind of stuff we look for. So. Very, this is, it's a nice day. You go to the park, you find kids in the park, and in this case, you make a really nice picture that literally captures the compositional concept we talk about in the golden ratio, right? You can literally see the arc of the golden ratio in this picture. It's almost funny. But, one of my favorite things to cover is the agricultural fairs. This is a great example. So those links are in the slideshow. You can feel free to go and look at those as you will. Obviously, you can look just at your daily newspapers and see what else they're doing. You can obviously look at the New York Times and the Washington Post and see what the big national news is. But short of being lucky like the students last semester, or the semester before, when President Biden came to campus and you had major national news right here on campus, you might not get that lucky. So you find what you can find. So, any questions? News feature photos? You're all carrying your phones all the time, so when you see something, take a picture of it, right? And then you just got to remember to get the information for your captions. All right, so I'm going to close that one out, and we're going to segue into, all right, so very, very quickly, in a sense. So we're going to talk about a little bit about the law, a little bit about photojournalism ethics. To be clear, you could spend most of a semester on both of these subjects, so this is the barely skimming the surface, but hopefully it's enough to give you a good grounding. The reading I'm going to give you for this week is the National Press Photographers Code of Ethics. I'll get to that in a moment because we're going to do legal first. All right, quick pop quiz. Who can tell me what this is?
First Amendment.
Everybody knew that, right? So, freedom of the press and the First Amendment, what makes it possible for all of us to have jobs. There are a lot of places that don't have any such freedom, and the people that they call journalists in those countries are not. They are propagandists. The First Amendment works in a number of different ways. The primary one, as the founders really saw it, was the right to actually publish, right? The founders were very big on this idea of being able to print your pamphlets, print your newspapers, didn't like the idea of the crown coming in and shutting you down or putting some unfair tax that made it impossible for you to distribute yours. The First Amendment has been interpreted to also include the right for us to go out and gather the news, all right? Not entirely within the freedom of the press, but really in that right to assemble. That's part of the freedom of the journalists are just like every other citizen of this country. We have the right to be out in public where everybody else is. So the government can't tell us, well, you're the press, you can't be here, right? The biggest problem I have as a photojournalist in a spot news scene is that the cops see my camera, come over and tell me, hey, you got to get out of here. Now there's 30 other people standing on that same street corner watching the same thing, but because I'm wearing a little badge and I carry a bunch of big fancy cameras, the cop suddenly thinks I'm the one who needs to leave. I've had a lot of conversations with cops, some of them not so friendly, about how the First Amendment works and how the Constitution works and how they're not supposed to make up the law, and they don't really appreciate that. So hence the reason I throw this photograph in there. Palm Beach Post photographers C.J. Walker and Ken Steinhoff were listening to their police scanners, and they heard a police chase, and they followed it to the end where the cops were arresting these people, and they got out of their car to go and take pictures, and this cop decided he didn't want pictures taken. So this is a really good example of the police officer not being as aware of the Constitution as perhaps one might expect given his position as an enforcer of the law in the United States. So this is a little chart that came out of that Cobre book that I showed you on the first day, which is the main text for most photojournalism classes around the country. You can go back and look at this in the slideshow when you want to later. It gives you sort of a pretty good idea of where you have sort of the full legal right to make photographs, because there are some reasonable legal limitations on where you can take photographs. The primary one is you can't take pictures on private property without the private property owner's permission. Anytime you're out in public, you're on the street, you're on the sidewalk, any sort of public facility, quite frankly, a university campus, as private as the university would like to be, this is a state university, so it's actually a public space. They really can't limit the photography. The university may have some rules that specifically apply to you as students and your behavior, and you may want to figure out what those are, but most places on campus you can make pictures. There are limits when you get into situations in public schools because there are minors involved. The schools are allowed to make some rules. Medical facilities have very strict laws. The health, what does health HIPAA stand for again? Health Insurance Portability and Privacy Act. Privacy laws around medical care are pretty stringent, and those will certainly restrict what you can do in and around a hospital or a clinic or anything like that. And then things like places that are private but open to the public, shopping malls, despite the fact that it's entirely accessible to the public, it is nonetheless private property. They have the right to kick anybody out anytime they want for whatever reason, and that includes photojournalists. We very often have to get special permission to go into malls to do things. Fortunately, malls are a fading thing and not really a big deal anymore. Most malls are going out of business. And, like for instance, and then the last line there is in private, anyone's home, apartment, hotel room, car, you have to have permission from the person who's in charge of that space. So, any questions on the basics of legal access? I said during the caption discussion that there's no legal right to privacy in the public sphere. So if you're out in a public space and someone says to you, you can't take my picture, I have a right to privacy, they don't understand the law. And then you have to make a decision for yourself. And this is where legal and ethics sort of intersect, how important it is to push your legal rights against their perceived preferences. The policy we have at the day is that unless there is an overriding journalistic issue involved, which is to say if something is distinctly newsworthy and therefore we will choose to ignore might choose to ignore someone's preference in that area, someone who is in the public sphere but expresses a desire for privacy, we grant that. So if I take a picture of someone on the street walking their dog or walking their kid or shoveling their snow off their walk, and they say, I don't want my picture in the paper, I'm going to go ahead and honor that, even though I'm not legally obligated to. Right? So you have to learn where to draw that line. It can be a little tricky, but generally what I say is if someone is doing something that is newsworthy that supersedes their desire for privacy, we're not generally going to honor that. I mean, if I'm in a Black Lives Matter protest and there are people who are, throwing things and making a fuss, and they say, oh, well, don't take my picture, I don't want to get in trouble, my response is, you're in public and you're doing something that, is newsworthy. So if you don't want to get in trouble, don't do something that's going to get you in trouble, because that's what I'm here to take pictures of. So, and that we can spend a whole semester discussing that whole issue, but I just want you to be sort of aware of where things stand with your legal rights as well as sort of your moral and ethical rights. Very quickly, Professor Shanahan mentioned copyright last semester. It's especially important if you are publishing a website that you don't use someone else's photograph without their permission. So at the most basic, I'll just go over this. Once you create an image, you have created your copyright. You own that image. It is yours. You control whether or not someone else may use it. You may control how it may or may not be used. The biggest modifier to basic copyright is employment status. I, for instance, don't own the copyright of the pictures I take for the day. The day is my employer, and as a term of my employment, they own my copyright. The term for that is called work for hire. There was a big movement that has carried over for a couple of decades now, where freelancers are often being asked to turn over their copyright as part of the terms of the freelance agreement. There are plenty of legal experts who don't believe that that's fair and may or may not be fully legal, but if an employer says to you, here's the terms under which I will grant you employment, freelance employment, and they include you granting me the copyright, you have to decide for yourself whether or not you're willing to give up your copyright. If you go to work for the Associated Press as a freelance photographer, not as a staffer, they're going to expect the copyright of your images. So if you go to the basketball game tonight, the AP photographer there is taking pictures of the basketball game, well, that photographer has signed a contract giving their copyright over to the Associated Press in exchange for the small amount of money the AP pays them. So just because something's been published on the web doesn't mean it exists in a public domain. Professor Shanahan, I think, wanted to be very clear about this. Just because you can right-click on something doesn't mean that you can use it. Now, I tell you to right-click on images and send them to me the curation assignment. That's a part of the educational process. You're not republishing that image. You're not using that image in a way that would hurt the commercial value of the image. So you can do that. But you couldn't go put it on your website and promote your work using it. So, and then just very quick, copyright exists because you've made the picture, but to protect it legally, it needs to be registered, which is going to the Copyright Office website, and you literally upload your images to the copyright and tell them it's your image, and it becomes registered. That's a situation where if you've done that and someone misuses your photograph, you have much stronger legal position to protect that image and to get compensated for it. All right. I have just a few minutes. This is the NPPA's Code of Ethics. Like I said, I'm going to give you the link so you can read it. I want you to read it. The NPPA is the largest organization in the country of professional photojournalists. Our Code of Ethics, and I say our Code of Ethics because I'm the chair of the NPPA's Ethics Committee and helped write this, is the industry standard for photojournalism ethics. Tens of thousands of photojournalists working in this country today live by this code. I'm not going to read all of these, but be accurate and comprehensive in representation of subjects, resist being manipulated by staged photo opportunities, be complete and provide context when photographing or recording subjects. So you need to read through these because these are very important. They're the underlying tenets for everything we do as photojournalists. So I'm going to talk really quickly just about some nice egregious cases of violations of ethics so that you can see what happens out there. 1982, National Geographic wanted to put the Great Pyramids on the cover of an issue of the magazine. This is the picture the photographer sent them. This is the cover they ran. Can anybody tell me what happened? I'll toggle back and forth. Trick is to look at that sort of notch on the right-hand pyramid and see relatively the left-hand pyramid. They cut and pasted. This is before Photoshop. They actually used a completely different process, but nonetheless, they cut and pasted the photograph in a way to make the smaller pyramid closer to the larger pyramid so they would both fit in that vertical cover format for the magazine. I will also say, to add insult to injury, we found out years later that the photographer actually paid those men to ride those camels back and forth in front of the pyramids to make the photograph. That's another topic we're about to get to. LA Times photographer Brian Walsky was in Iraq for the beginning of the Iraq War in 2003. He didn't like the way these two pictures on the right looked to him, so he went into Photoshop and carefully cut them in half and put them together to make the photograph you see that actually ran in the Los Angeles Times. The staff at the Hartford Courant, which was a sister paper of the Los Angeles Times, both owned by the Tribune Company, looked at this photograph when it came across the company's wire and said, that doesn't really look right. They know what they primarily noticed, if you'll look, is this guy right here appears, where is he? He's here, and maybe that's not me. Anyway, somebody's repeating in there. What is they like? Anyway, Walsky clearly thought he liked the way the hand was out in one photograph, but the body language of the guy holding the child in the other photograph. The Courant called the Times. The Times called their photographer in LA on a sat phone and said, there's something fishy about this photograph. What happened? And he said, oh, geez, I'm sorry. And they said, yeah, you're fired. Get on the next plane home and turn in all your equipment. You're done. So, another example, a few years later, Alan Dietrich of the Toledo Blade was fired. Quick question, tell me the difference between picture A and picture B. What is it?
It's the
feet under the banner, yeah. Yeah, Dietrich made the picture that you see on the top, sat down at his computer, realized he didn't like those legs sticking out from underneath that banner, so he removed them. Somebody noticed that, mentioned it to the paper. The paper was a little curious and did what they call a forensic audit of all of his work. Went through the archives and found that he had been doing this on a regular occurrence over the years. The picture on the left is the actual picture he took. The picture on the right is the one that ran in the paper. Alan Dietrich was fired and now spends his time as a storm chaser in the Midwest with his brother, who is also a former photojournalist. They chase tornadoes. A few years later, Brian Patrick of the Sacramento Bee. All right, the two pictures on the top are the two pictures he took. The picture on the bottom is the one that he turned into the paper. Basically, the difference is that he didn't like the way the frog looked in the beak of the bird on the right in the shot where the other bird is actually reaching out. So he replaced the bird on the right from a different picture where you can see the leg of the frog, so you know what the birds are fighting over. One of the other birders who was out at this was he was covering a birding event. Public was invited out to go with some professional ornithologists to look at birds. One of the other birders saw his picture in the paper and had taken pictures at the same time and called the paper up and said, that's not right, that's not what it looked like. They did an audit. Turns out, Brian Patrick was playing fast and loose. So, years earlier, Mike Meadows, a freelancer covering wildfires in California for the Los Angeles Times, turned this photograph in. Paper ran it big in their coverage. End of the year, they were getting ready to do their Pulitzer Prize entry. decided to do a little fact checking on all the images before they entered them in the Pulitzer. They called this firefighter up who explained that standing there watching the fire burn, Mike Meadows turned to the firefighters and said, what would really make a great photograph is if somebody were kneeling there by the side of the pool throwing water over his head. One of the firefighters thought that was a good suggestion, so he went and did it. Meadows made the picture and turned it in. Meadows' defense, of course, was that he didn't tell them to do it, he just mentioned it and they did it on their own. That's a gray area we're not going with. Italian photographer Paolo Pellegrin was on assignment for the Magnum Agency covering gun culture in America. He went to Rochester, New York, and was working with some photojournalism students from the Rochester Institute of Technology. Unfortunately, they were having trouble finding anybody who owned guns who would show them their guns. One of the students who was along for the trip was, I have guns, I'm a gun owner. So they went to the student's house, and Pellegrin took a picture of the student with his shotgun in the kid's basement. Nobody really thought anything of it until Pellegrin won an award for the photographs, and the RIT student saw himself holding the gun with this caption that suggested that he was just another member of the gun culture. So Pellegrin had the award taken away and got in some bit of trouble with his agency, but is still working to this day. And then just a few years ago, another Italian photographer went to Belgium to photograph the city that he had decided was the dark heart of Europe. It was beset by economic crises, by right-wing political uprising. So he went around and photographed all of the things that were bad in this lovely city in Belgium. Won an award for it from the World Press Photo Contest. And the mayor of this Belgian town, complained because he didn't like his town being pictured as the dark heart of Europe. But then more people came forward, and it was discovered that the photographer was particularly selective in his point of view of what he photographed, but also B, after everybody told him about this part of town where people went to have their romantic liaisons in the cars, he discovered he couldn't get any good pictures of them because they all turned the cars off in the dark, and so it was just cars in a dark field that you can't photograph. So he got his cousin to park his car and leave the lights on. So it's not just the digital manipulation, it's not just taking two photographs to make one photograph that's perfect. It's the idea that you do not tell your subjects what to do, with the exception of the portrait, the posed photograph that we clearly understand is posed and is set up for our benefit. In our news photographs, we do not tell people, do this for me. And there's that link. So I'll just give you a real recent example. A young photographer out in Portland, Oregon, was covering a anti-mask protest. The anti-mask people were burning masks in a barrel and rallying outside the state health department in Portland. And it was getting to the end of the event, and the protesters were putting out the water in the barrel, but mother of a little boy who wanted to burn a mask came up and told the little boy, here, if you get a mask, we'll throw it in there and the nice photographer will take your picture. And the photographer said, yeah, sure, I'll do that. And then, made the mistake of making an offhand comment about, well, I'd give you my mask to throw in there, but I can't do that. And the next thing she knew, some of the Black Bloc protesters who were there to counter-protest the anti-maskers caught her on video making that flip comment and then taking a picture of a kid throwing someone else's mask in the barrel. So the next thing she knew, Getty Images, who she'd been on assignment for, has fired her. Reuters, who she's done work for, has fired her, and she's embroiled in this controversy. Now, she didn't mean to set up the photograph. She's talked to the editor of NPPA's magazine. She was just caught up in this moment. She made what she thought was a flip comment, which clearly suggested that maybe she might have been suggesting how to set up the photograph. So she's issued this apology, but her career may be permanently damaged from just this flip comment. Had she deleted the photograph, a little boy throwing the mask into the fire, it's possible everything would have been fine, but we have to be ultra careful. As journalists, our credibility relies entirely on people believing us and believing that what we're telling them is true. It is factual. So we can't even make a flip comment and think that we're going to get away with it. We have to say as true to these ethics as we possibly can. When we're reporting, it means we don't make up quotes, we don't lead our subjects into saying what we want them to say. We let them say what they're saying, and if what they say supports the story, then that's great. But we don't manipulate the facts. We don't manipulate them in the words, and we don't manipulate them in the photographs. So like I said, read the NPPA's Code of Ethics, really sort of digest that. Well, maybe we'll try and find a few minutes next week to discuss a little more. I will also post these links, which include some basic legal concepts around privacy and street photography, as well as the setup here at the top is very, let's see if I can get that big enough to read. There's, as I was talking about the idea of privacy and consent in the public sphere, there's an ongoing discussion in photojournalism now around whether or not people can demand that you get their consent before you take their picture in public. And so there's a couple of articles of a couple of people debating either side of that subject. So it's something to think about. So, and that, like I said, so first news photo is due next week. I will be looking at your portrait assignments starting tonight. Read the Code of Ethics, think about it, and yeah, that's everything. So, any questions before you all dash out of here to your next class? No? Okay, good. Thank you all very much for coming. Have a good week. It's going to warm up, they tell me. You know, if you can believe the people that call themselves meteorologists, right? Meteorology is not a science, it's a religion.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a good week.
You too.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
You're very welcome. Have a good week.